if indeed we are one, then the environment is not the environment. The environment is not out there. The environment is within. Not in that strong Cartesian way either, because we are part of the rock. The rock isn't just part of us. We are part of the rock or the mountain or the thought. So discussions around environment become themselves colonizing because there is no such thing as environment.
Hello and welcome back to the We Need to Act, your go-to podcast for sustainability education. If you are new here, I'm Sara, an academic and sustainability professional passionate about unpacking complex social and environmental challenges and turning them into clear, informed action. Each episode, I sit down with inspiring guests from around the world to explore the systems, stories, and solutions shaping our future. Today, we are joined by Carl Mika, a leading voice in Māori and Indigenous philosophy. From the Tūhorangi, he's a professor of Māori and Indigenous philosophies and head of School of Aotearoa, School of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Canterbury. Thank you, Carl, for joining us on the We Need to Act podcast. It is a great honor to share this space with you and to benefit from all the knowledge that you bring to this conversation. And for listeners, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. And thanks for having me on, by the way, inviting me. So my name is Carl Mika. I am from Tūhorangi and Ngāti Whānauapiti, which are two tribal groupings within Aotearoa, Māori tribal groupings. I work at the University of Canterbury as a professor there. I am also currently head of school. And I have a background in a few things, a background in law. I practiced law for a little while. I also have a background in PhD in German studies, of all things, which was, really enjoyed. And also Indigenous studies and Māori studies also have background in.
Yeah, that's why we have invited you to join us, because on this podcast, we have been inviting different, I would say, Indigenous leaders and academics from all over the world. And because this is a sustainability education podcast, and what we want to bring to this conversation is different perspectives that can lead us towards sustainability. I wanted to start by asking you that for many people outside, how do I pronounce this? Aotearoa?
Aotearoa, that's right.
New Zealand, Maori culture is often associated with things like the haka, the tamoko, or movies like Moana. This is mass culture that tries to translate. What do you think is missing or misunderstood in these common perceptions of your culture?
Quite a bit is misunderstood. But there are some less obvious things that are talked about. People have, I think, written extensively about the expropriation of the outward sort of performative signs of being another culture, which appeal to the consumerist. But there's a few things they miss. There's the aspect of colonisation that's missed there. That isn't automatically obvious in the signs. In the haka and things like that, that are taken or expropriated, those forms of them. So what I'm saying is colonisation is not evident in the expropriated form of the performance of the thing. But the other thing that's not there is the day-to-day experience of being Māori. So what that means is that it ends up being quite funny, the outcome, because it's like a weird parody to me anyway. Those sort of things taken out of their context become almost hilarious. They're very strange because they're not surrounded. They're not contextualized at all. It's just suddenly you kind of see something being enacted, which is obviously Māori. To me, it ends up being almost so inauthentic that it ends up being funny.
Like that video from that, I think it was in the parliament with one of the parties that was circulating.
Yeah, but there's a context there. There is a context there, and there's an everyday experience of being Māori implicit within that act. But when it happens overseas, or when it's taken and expropriated, actually, if that's what you were originally asking, I can't remember, but it's taken out of its context, then it ends up being, to me, it ends up being funny. So, but when it's being done in a context, when it's being done in a more authentic way, should we put it that way? I don't really like the word authentic, but it's one that's useful here. Then the person who's watching, who's not familiar with it, might just see it as being, just being a spectacle. But for us, we know what it means. We tend to understand where it's coming from and what it's grounded in.
Do you think it has helped spread, I think, Maori culture?
Probably. When you, no denying that, but it's the impact that's the way in which people will interface with. So with things like, did you mention Moana at all? Did you mention?
Yeah, the movie.
Yeah, with something like that, yes, of course there will be people who understand. I've actually never seen it, but people who understand it
from this side of the
people
world.
will probably look at it and think, I mean, do people realise it is taken from other cultures? Like it is, isn't that right? They do realise that. I'm assuming they do.
Yeah, they do, of course.
Yeah.
Without it gives some kind of context.
So it probably does make certain cultures more well known, but only that the iceberg in that superficial way. Yeah,
it is kind of modern colonization in terms of discourse, right?
Yeah, that's what people would argue about that. Those arguments have been around for some time to do with cultural and intellectual property.
Appropriation.
Yeah.
But Maori culture has survived colonization and has been powerfully revitalized in recent decades. Yet many, deep wounds remain, as in many other indigenous cultures. From your experience and thinking and knowledge, what you have studied, how do you live with that history today?
Well, I'm interested in that question because I actually think probably what needs to be focused on, and I'd be interested in your views on this, is the ways in which the coloniser has been impacted by their actions. So Māori, we tend to know we're colonised. Does the coloniser know that they are doing damage to themselves in the process of colonisation? I mean, I think that's a much more interesting question. So we as if the colonised always are being impacted, and they are, but that the colonised sails through easily and just doesn't, their own state of being is not brought into question so much. Apart from that, they are very people, but there's a deep spiritual wound, I think. I mean, there's no way to know, there's no way to prove that. That's something that's almost more important for me as a question, I think, than
we were colonizers, the Portuguese people. And as far as I know, we haven't actually recognized that in our history, in the way we talk about the past, in the way we acknowledge things, like how we mistreated people during that time. But of course, we always see things in the lens of today, right? Because at that time, probably no one would question what they were doing. But I think at the present time, we should be questioning and discussing our past history. So that the sheer fragmentation or isolation of the colonizer from certain aspects of being, I suppose, has to be detrimental for them. Yeah. I wouldn't be. And it might not appear to be at the time because the void is being filled, they're filling the void with accumulated things and newfound experiences and new knowledge, but they're still left with their empty selves. That's true. That may be individual or maybe kind of a collective metaphysical problem. Yeah. And I was recalling a conversation I had with Tyson Yunkaporta. Do you know him? I know of him, yeah. Yeah. And I was recalling, and he was saying something like, kind of, there is no bad, or I mean, he was trying to explain that history was made with this interaction, right, between colonizers and indigenous. And the outcome was from that interaction. So it couldn't there isn't something like this was bad, or this was wrong, or this was how it happened. Because for things to happen, it needs to have an interaction. A possibility, yeah. But I definitely think it's the colonizer, and we're probably in some respects, many of us are all colonizers now in some way. Yeah. And indigenous in other way. Possibly, but not the primary colonizers. There's something to be said for the
coloniser to look inwards and to think about where their deep the deep wounding goes. That led them to carry out what they did in the first place.
But have you been, I know that you're still fighting for your rights and for your culture, but what do you see it should be done for you to be kind of more at peace?
I think there's some new focuses, particularly, and because I primarily work in the area of philosophy, I think there are some new areas that haven't yet really been talked about that probably need to be, and they're ones that aren't quantifiable. So you can't go out and measure them through any scientific method or anything like that. They rely more on your speculative power and what your position is, what your ontological position is to begin with. So if your position is that the world is interconnected, for instance, which if you pick up most Indigenous people's literature, they will say that overwhelmingly. I wouldn't mind betting, and I've said this before, I think, I wouldn't mind betting that maxim, that law, is one of the most widely cited within Indigenous literature, that the world is connected in some form or other. But if that's your initial position, if that's your stance, if that's your foundational principle, then presumably everything flows from that, right? But it becomes conscious. It has to become a conscious thing because it runs counter to what we taught at a subconscious way. So we have to retain that, and what we have to do is take it within our ways of explaining or ways of talking about or ways of using something and talk about how that's a colonised way of doing it. So one of the ways that occurs to me when you were talking before was the idea of language. How can we view language differently? How can we view term differently, rather than its denotative meaning, or even its metaphorical meaning, if you want to endorse the idea that there is such a thing as metaphor for Indigenous people. How can we think of language? What is the specialness of language that, for instance, Māori often cite? We often talk about language being special, our own language. Now, it's partly in the usual dictionary definition of a term that can be very special. But I actually think we need to consider other ways in which language is, specialness of language, rather than that way that we're taught to think about language. Do you know what I'm saying? Primarily, it's correct meaning, correct grammar. And that could be for instance, what language doesn't declare or something like that. And if you think about what language doesn't declare, the things that we understand to be implicit within language because it's a representative of the all, of everything. So if we understand language to be not just about the one thing that a term is referring to, but about everything, then our speculative powers become much more important. So we're able then to have almost a creative access to thinking about what that whole kind of mystery or aura to do with that, rather than being straitjacketed to its meaning. So going back to colonisation, we're then starting to think about how we can use language in a different way, other than the correct way, or the way in which we think about it in terms of conventional logic. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you feel?
That's just one example.
How
do I feel when I speak it? I mean, I don't often speak it.
But do you speak fluently?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No. No. I would like to learn. I'd like to go back and to refresh a bit on it. But I just...
Oh, my question was about if you were fluent in Māori and in English, how would you feel if you would feel differently speaking this different language? I remember...
you'd be able to talk about things differently. Maybe there would be more...
Even the worldview is different.
Yeah, more. But you can use things. You can use, and I wonder if this is happening more and more, you can possibly use Māori in a way which doesn't do anything more than what English does, particularly. But I do think, language is just... So I picked language as one example. The way in which we view the self is another thing. We're aware in our academic discourses that the self is everything else as well. But when it comes to how the academic person writes, the academic Māori, there's still not a way of writing it open to us where we can firmly implant ourselves within what's being talked about. And that's a colonised way of talking about it. So that goes to another point about what you were saying, another example of ways we operate in a colonised way, or under the, how we operate under the colonisation. Yeah.
And what do you think it needs to change? Because I'm also an academic and researcher here at the university, and oftentimes when I think about writing about Indigenous cultures, because my main focus is sustainability communication, and I want to bring these worldviews because I think there's a lot of answers in the way other cultures speak about sustainability. And but I often feel like, or questioning myself, am I appropriating? Because as you said, language is also colonized.
Well, it's not just language, it's the way, it's the structure of an academic piece of work is colonised. So, it doesn't allow you to introduce, in order to be understandable and objectively comprehensible, so that I can pick up what you write and I can understand it, and vice versa. I mean, imagine if we had a kind of language where that wasn't important so much, but it had to have an impact somehow on the reader, and it had to remind the reader of what they didn't know, what was not accessible to them, rather than picking up a piece of writing and assuming that that's going to add to our knowledge. But imagine if we had a way of writing that was introduced that actually was opposite of that. There's a very important lesson in being taught that you can't access everything, you can't know everything. And that's a really important thing. I think that's a really important assumption underpinning a lot of Māori thought, actually. You're not just a knowing human being.
And circling back to what you previously said about, in Māori worldviews, humans are not seen as superior to the rest of existence, but as fundamentally intertwined, interconnected with land, ancestors, and non-human life. And by contrast, we Western traditions, often shaped by particular religions and philosophical ideas, have separate nature and from human and have dominated nature. Do you see a connection between this worldview and today's ecological crisis?
Yeah, I don't think that that's controversial at all, is it? A lot of people have written about that. I'm not really up to speed with the writings or the discourses about sustainability, but I'm assuming it's all written about quite extensively, quite frequently, that a worldview leads to how you interact with the environment. Is that right? Is there still a lot of writing about that? Or have people moved on? Have people tended to think, oh, it's all being written about, we don't want to repeat it? Was there good writing out there on it?
No, I think there's still a lot of writing about this. And it's much needed because we haven't still incorporated that into our ways of living.
But if indeed we are one, then the environment is not the environment. The environment is not out there. The environment is within. And not in that strong Cartesian way either, because we are part of the rock. The rock isn't just part of us. We are part of the rock or the mountain or the thought, So discussions around environment become themselves colonizing because there is no such thing as environment.
True. That's a great way of putting things. As Casey Camp-Horinek, do you know her? Yeah. She's an Indigenous from the Ponca Nation in the United States. And we are nature itself, as she said during our conversation. And yes, if we separate, we are colonizing.
We're assuming when we talk about environmental sustainability, then that we're sustaining something that is outside us. So maybe
it is the opposite. The outside is sustaining us. But we cannot see it, unfortunately.
We cannot see that it's part of us?
Well, in general, I think people don't understand that, still feel superior to, even talking about giving an example of the pets we have at home. Of course, many people do assume them as relatives and treat them as child. But looking at my parents, for instance, they still look at our pets like they are part of the outside. They cannot come inside. We are separated. They are animals. They cannot feel.
That thought is, the opposite is that thought is just ours. So a thought or an idea is just a human phenomenon. Māori belief or a Māori philosophy, there's wide scope for the idea that thought settles on the all, and encompasses the all. And human beings are included in that, but it isn't exclusive to the human being. So there's not these kind of reorientations needed about how the self relates to everything else.
Interesting. And I was thinking about the awe. I think we once had that in our relationship with nature, the awe, and we lost it. I remember a book I read some time ago. It was The Sacred Nature. I think it was Karen Armstrong. And she was mentioning about that, how we used to feel this feeling of awe regarding nature and how we lost it throughout the centuries. And now we only have this dominion, this feeling of dominance.
But it's alienation. It's alienation for the human being. It's not good for the human being to be like that.
There's a lot of studies that say that we really need nature. We part of nature, but for our well-being, we need to be with our feet in the ground, walking in nature. It's part of our well-being.
When you talk about sustainability, what sort of work do you do within that area?
Well, I mainly focus on in terms of research or in terms of professionally.
Yeah, professionally, I guess.
Well, in terms of professionally, I work with companies, helping them communicating their sustainability agendas, but in a way that it is focused on dialogue and not greenwashing, trying to bring to the table all the different perspectives from all the different stakeholders. And I don't like the word. I don't like that concept. But I think we need to discuss sustainability. I think we need to communicate sustainability, but in a different way. We have to make sustainability part of our lives, not an add-on. But, and I always remember things that I've learned from past guests. And I was recalling Kimokeu Kapahulehua. He's from Hawaii, Hawaiian Indigenous leader. And he was saying that today it is sustainability. Yesterday it was life. So that's how we have to see it in terms of communication, integrate sustainability in the way we do things, because it was
take it back to life. Take it back to life again.
Yes.
Take it away from sustainability and back to life.
Yes. That's how I like to think about it. And in terms of research, academic research, my focus is in, corporate sustainability communication, of course, but I'm focused on understanding these different worldviews, different narratives, and how they speak about nature, about this interconnectedness between humans, nature, non-human beings, and how we are all interconnected and interrelated. This dependency, because I think there entails the secret, not the secret, but not maybe the solution to a better understanding of our place on this world.
Interconnection is probably where you get a lot of Indigenous comments. I think there needs to be much more sort of probably the work of academics to just focus on what that would look like. What is interconnection as an abstract principle? And then maybe other people can figure out, or whoever can figure out how that would relate to everyday instances. I think ultimately, it could be wrong actually, but my view is that discussions about, thinking about interconnection as an abstract thing to do. And that's academics are generally, we're quite lucky to be able to do that. We're in positions where we can do that because we've got the time and the space. But there does need to be some quite kind of engaged abstract formulations, I guess, of what that would look like. And quite long ones, because it's such an important concept for us, whatever that concept is. So for instance, and I've said this in my writing before, I think, in one way or another, interconnection probably takes at least two forms, possibly three. It's either that we're connected on a wheel of energy, and we are connected to that extent, so we are interconnected, but we're also sort of separate because it's the energy that runs through that kind of brings us together. That's quite a common view of what interconnection is. But the other one, which is for me fascinating because it's so deeply opposed to the way institutions are set up now, let's put it that way, is that the world is completely one. I am, in fact, that table, that mountain is, in fact, me. We appear to be operating in different spheres, but that's not the way it is. And that's more radical, I think, than the first option.
Yeah, definitely.
There is no becoming, for instance. There is no becoming in oneness because It's like all there is this deep-set resonance that happens because everything is full with everything, right? So if there's any becoming, it's that. There's not really any kind of becoming in the sense we usually talk about it. It's more like a resonance. And the possible third one is that there's a combination of both, which means that exactly the moment something is one, it is also not completely, but it is separate but connected. And that's a sort of a weird paradox, I think, or contradiction that is very hard to get our heads around and is possibly even more radical than just simply saying that the world is one. So then as an academic, how you would actually, or someone who works in sustainability, for instance, how would you represent what you talk about and how would I represent what I talk about in a way which is authentic with the topic? What are our means of writing about these things or thinking about these things, articulating these things generally? What are our tools at our disposal to represent ethically this oneness of everything, or this oneness and contradiction of everything? How do we order things in the world, or what is our logic system that enables us to ethically articulate this? We don't have it.
No, exactly. No, and it's overwhelming. I don't know. Is that even possible?
It might not be, but what you're then demonstrating is your human incapacity to reach that ambitious point, which is valuable in itself. That goes back to what I was saying before about the limitations of human knowledge. And rather than just simply reaching it and going, oh, we might be able to find our way around it and know what we want to know through this avenue, is just going, okay, this has been really valuable. I can't know this. And it's taught me simply that I've reached my limitations.
Yeah. I was trying to think in a specific example. For instance, how to represent this sense of the all in the concept of sustainability. Because the concept of sustainability, as we know today, is a concept that was created or actually introduced, partially sustainable development, by the United Nations. And it's very colonized in a way because it's how can we meet the needs of the present and the needs which we have different needs from all over the world, from different countries, different populations, different stages in terms of development, and then meet the needs of future generations, which we don't know. And also future generations will have different needs. How could we, in the concepts of sustainability, be fair and include everyone and represent that sense of all?
I mean, it's probably better than nothing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the notion of sustainability than to not have anything.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, definitely.
But it's the mistake would be in thinking that we've landed on the correct concept and we can just rest with that and work with that, because it's not either. Right.
Well, in your writing, you talked about the Māori philosophy as being grounded in what we have been discussing now, this deep sense of the all, where everything is connected and even one. And I think, well, in general, people are not wired to think about interconnectedness. If it is intrinsic to your culture, it is easier for you to understand because it's part of your group knowing that. But if it's outside concept, I don't think in general people are not wired to think about this interconnectedness of all systems. It is complex, and complex doesn't mean it is complicated. Sometimes complex things can be simple.
Yep.
But in this case, I think it is hard for people to understand. If education is to remain meaningful today, what do you think it can learn from your way of seeing the world, the Māori way?
It's long been said that the education system generally compartmentalizes disciplines, and but it doesn't work well with Māori. But there's a few other things. There's that stuff about knowledge that I was talking about, the knowledge project of colonisation, where you're taught to accumulate knowledge. Education is premised largely still on how much you know and what your faculty is, what your facility is, rather, to be able to set out and to know something or to know things. I don't really think that sits well with Māori philosophy either, Māori foundational philosophy. So whatever those discussions are that have to be around reorienting it, so that those aren't privileged, those ways of thinking aren't privileged. Those, how would you have an education system where it wasn't so much about knowledge? You would have knowledge being imparted, but it wouldn't be the primary aim. So we have to have discussions what the primary aim of education would be. If it's not that, then what would it be? I personally don't know. Is it about speculative thought at maybe a tertiary level? Yeah. So, we get to do what we've been doing today, and that is to kind of think about, with a lack of complete certainty about something, and we'd be able to use modes of language, whether in English or Māori or whatever, to be able to adequately represent the topic of discussion. And we'd have the speculative language there to be able to do that. I mean, as you say, it sounds pretty simple in principle, but to be able to take it into years of life, that's a different thing altogether, isn't it?
Yes. And how do you see technology helping it, the role of technology, now that we are in this?
That's something that I haven't quite, that's something that I haven't quite. I've thought about it and then gone, that's for another day. Well, in principle, it's part of the all.
Yeah, like
As much as something like colonisation is, actually. So, maybe it has a role to play in that. But I think, we would have to consider how deeply implicated we are within the technology that we're talking about. We'd have to understand ourselves as part of that technology. I'm not sure how fond I am of that.
Mm-hmm. Me neither.
But that's, by the by, that's my thing. That might be tough luck for me,
Uh-huh. And that brings me to the next question, which is connected to the part of the community and relationships that it is so strong in your culture. And with technology, and we have been isolating ourselves, and it pushes us towards individualism and isolation. So, and I'm afraid that it will get worse in the future. With the AI and the digital. Tyson also said that it is a tool, but it's a different tool. It is a tool that we can relate to. Of course, the other tools were like an extension of human beings, but this tool, we can have a relationship with it, which is weird, right? Because we are replacing traditional relationships based on community by the digital relationships. That will change the all, right? It is part of the all, but how is it?
Well, I think, we are not aware of how far it could go, and we could have something which doesn't even resemble AI in the future, but is much cool.
And are there Māori teachings or practices that could help us reconnect with one another?
There are loads, but I would say that one of the most overlooked ones is that it's not a conscious teaching, I don't think, but it is how to go about relationships with each other without having to have a formal structure around them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like just being with people and being easy with people. I'm not the most easy with people, but this thing of like,
you seem quite friendly.
I can be. It depends what's going on. So, you probably see it in your professional life where you talk about collaborations with people, but the collaborations are formally structured. When really what's all that's needed is you just go up and go, hey, how's it going? Let's get together and have a coffee or something and think about how we could do this. But first you build a relationship with someone. You don't rush in there and go, let's collaborate on this article or whatever. You actually just go, it'd be really good to get to know you. Let's have a cuppa and coffee and let's just get to know each. I think there would be one way in which Māori are, we're pretty good at that. Sort of sussing out people and building relationships is really important for us. But that goes to a much bigger thing of how people relate to people and how we approach each other. So I don't think there's lots and lots of things like, if someone dies, you get together and you grieve for them collectively and you talk to them. There's things like that well known. But the lesser well known ones are the day-to-day things, as I was talking about before, where how you relate to people is more at ease and less structured and less self-conscious, really.
It's more
That's
natural.
not for everyone. That's why I pointed out that I'm not necessarily the best person to be talking. I mean, awkwardness reigns supreme amongst a lot of us. But in principle, I think we still are like that. We still are quite good at going, hey, how's it going? Let's get together and just have a chat. Even in our professional lives.
It's more easygoing, natural.
More easygoing and a little bit of humour involved. It's not so uptight. I think, the coloniser needs to learn to stop being so uptight. You know, there's something just at a very basic level, incredibly uptight about it all. You almost feel like going up a bit of a, just to kind of reset them, you know? I'm talking about not individuals, although sometimes, but more the culture. You want the culture of uptightness to be relaxed.
That's right. This, we think, where did it all start?
Probably the Industrial Revolution, I suspect.
Yeah, probably. And capitalism.
Yeah.
And the corporate world. Yeah, wealth.
Yeah. There'll be a lot of contributing factors to it, I'd imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting reflection, food for thought. Moving forward, and this question, I want to hear from you because I'm a mystic person. And in Maori cosmology, creation begins with, how do you say, tore?
Te kore, yeah.
Te kore. And tepo. Is it right? So nothingness and darkness before moving into the te ao marama. Is that
Yep, that's right. Yep.
The world of light? And we definitely need this today. So probably we need to go into the darkness to see the light. And in a culture that often fears darkness and uncertainty, what can these ideas teach us about growth and becoming, and looking at the present events?
Yeah, there's a lot that can be said at that part. This question raises a lot of concerns, doesn't it? It does raise the issue of mystery. So both those terms, te kore and te po, have some relationship with mystery because of the formlessness of things, their obscurity. But it's also a lesson in that you can't be happy all the time. The striving for perfection and for happiness is like a form of denial.
Tidiness.
Yeah. Yep. Tidiness. There's a whole lot of things that go with that. Orderliness, intellect, they all feed into this idea that you can keep things, neat and tidy. That's not necessarily going to happen, including our own outcomes, as humans. We can't assure our own survival at the moment. We can't be sure of it. So that's all part of darkness and nothingness as well. Maybe we go back to there. So, and
is it the beginning or is it the end?
Well, it's this beginning and end is also very, very interesting because it's now you're getting into like a Māori metaphysics of time, and te kore and te po are still here. That's what I think is very important to understand. Just as evident as te ao marama, but we ignore them because we're taught to think in terms of enlightenment, and they are still very much here. And they pop up in a huge way, both huge and subtle. So at an individual level, it can be both subtle and quite traumatic. But as a group of humans, as human beings, can crop up in quite big ways, quite radical ways. But we're not used to it because we're so focused on what I've called before the chirping optimism of the light. But that's not realistic. I'm not the first person to say that. It's not.
But is this nothingness and darkness? Because people often think of it as something bad.
Yeah, they do. It's because it's full of the unknown, and you can't work out a way through it to begin with. There's no method. There's no method for operating with
like
nothingness and darkness. Yeah, probably. It's like you go along for the ride, you go along for the experience. There's very little you can do when you're in it. Of course, I'm not saying you should discard the light. It's just as important, but there's so much emphasis on it from a Māori perspective that it ends up being really imbalanced.
We need a light, actually, to see the contrast. Yeah. Could we perceive the darkness if we didn't have the light?
Well, actually, we're using language which might not relate to Māori worldview anyway. So we talk about light being the absence of dark, but that might not be what marama was. It was never, perhaps, void of darkness or nothingness, but we're assuming that it is light. Now, you see what I mean?
It has been a very philosophical conversation, very interesting. And what do you think it will happen to the world? Are we going back to the nothingness and darkness?
I we're about to be delivered a short, sharp lesson on what those things really mean. Yeah, I don't know whether what's happening at the moment around the world is particularly new. I think look at it and go, oh, this has always been, it's always been this way. It's more visible perhaps, or it's because of social media, it's more accessible. We can see it.
Always been at war with each other.
Yeah. There's nothing particular going on which is out of the ordinary.
Yeah, probably
I do think will be like those other times that it's happened. There is going to be some sort of involvement of nothingness and darkness.
So we can then understand what light is.
Yeah. And how it's never free, completely free from the dark.
We have to balance both kind of forces. It is always about balance, finding the right balance. This has been a really interesting conversation. And
well, thank you very much for having me along. Yeah.
As we come to the end of this conversation, do you have any final words to our listeners?
No, I'm not one for giving advice. Because it means I'd have to live up to my own expectations. I don't know. I just think that and of course I would say this, every academic says this about their particular discipline or area or focus. I think there needs to be more focus on some of these issues. Starting with the abstract, starting with the foundational theoretical principle, and then moving that forward and understanding things anew from that perspective is quite important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you. And thank you for your time.
No problems.
That's it for today's episode. If you enjoy the conversation, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your network. Your support helps us grow this community, spark meaningful dialogue, and bring you more inspiring guests and valuable content. Let's act together for a better now.